Hi, thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to get started a couple of minutes after the top of the hour to make sure everybody has a chance to get in and set up in the GoToMeeting. So we'll be here and I'll get started here in about 2 minutes. Okay, I think we can get started. There's still a few folks filtering in, but we'll start slow. So welcome to today's webinar. The IMPLAN webinar today is Unveiling the Power of National Economic Impact Studies. I'm Bjorn Markeson, the Academic Divisional Director and an economist here at IMPLAN. I'll be hosting today's webinar, and what we're going to do is look at the scope and value of national level economic impact analysis. During the webinar, you'll probably have questions. So kind of two ways to do that. If it's during the middle of the webinar, go ahead and enter it into the chat box in the little GoToMeeting widget. If we do have time for live questions at the end, you can use the raise your hand icon and you'll be unmuted by us so you can answer that question. If we don't happen to have time to get to all of the questions that come up during today's webinar, or if for any reason I'm unable to answer a particular question, we will definitely follow up with you right away after the webinar to have a deeper conversation. So I just want to give an overview of what we're going to be covering today. With IMPLAN, really, decision makers have the tools they need to navigate complex economic landscapes and make decisions that propel their success. And we're going to look at three main topics today. The first is why you should do an economic impact study, but most importantly, thinking about this in terms of the scope of that analysis and reasons you might want to expand that to a national scope. So the value of looking at the impacts from an industry or a firm or a particular event at that national scale. The second is the benefits of challenges of local versus national level analysis. A lot of folks first come to IMPLAN looking at local analysis. We're kind of pointing out some of the things you're missing with that local kind of county level analysis that are available, and IMPLAN has the capacity to look at a broader regional or national scale. And then I'm going to show you a couple of different things. One is how a number of different organizations have leveraged national economic impact studies and what those kind of goals and results have looked like. And then I'm going to jump into IMPLAN itself and show kind of the capacity and the extent of what you can do when you move from a local economic impact to a more national scale. And again, using IMPLAN Cloud on that national scale can really be transformative for policy advocacy, supplier diversity analysis, public relations. It really cracks open the full range of industries and regions that a particular industry or firm or event touches with their their direct economic activity. So first, I want to delve into economic impact analysis at a really high level. We talk to folks all the time who are trying to understand the economic impact of their firm, industry, or event. So what do we mean by an economic impact analysis? For the purposes of what we're talking about today, an economic impact analysis really translates the initial impact of a firm or its direct effect. And when I say firm, we're thinking about this in terms of industries or events as well, and translates that direct impact into secondary effects. And these can be both what we call indirect, which are business to business expenditures. Think of that, that supply chain, and also induced effects from household expenditures related to that initial event. So what we're doing then is the goal of this type of analysis is to get a full understanding of the complete employment, labor income, GDP, and tax revenue impacts from that initial event. The way you can think about this is a new factory opens in a community. The employment and output associated with that factory is the direct effect. And these are usually pretty evident. You can, if you're the firm that's operating the factory, you know how many people you're employing. You know the output from that facility. But the indirect and induced effects can be harder to discern. And that's really where IMPLAN comes in. The modeling structure that IMPLAN uses helps to identify and estimate those indirect and induced effects, the supply chain and household expenditure effects, not just in the exact location where that factory is located, but linking that to the broader region or nation. And also, because the ripple effects are not necessarily obvious, it can be hard to tell what they are at the national level. If you're looking at a series of individual facilities that exist in individual locations, individual counties throughout the country, the sum of their effect in the country as a whole is greater than the sum of those county effects, because there's spillover effects, there's ripple effects that run up and down that supply chain and really have a much richer impact than what's happening directly at that local level. So when you're using IMPLAN to conduct an economic impact analysis, what are you really using? Well, IMPLAN is based on an input-output or social accounting matrix structure. Our particular model was initially designed by the US Forest Service to estimate the impacts of forest products industry at both the local and the national level. And it's been the industry standard for this type of analysis ever since. Over the years, we've expanded that capability and really broadened the audience of who can use IMPLAN by making it more intuitive and user-friendly with graphical interfaces, with guides and in-app wizards that help you really hone in on the question you're trying to ask, rather than manipulating the software itself. IMPLAN really is a time-tested and easy-to-use input-output model, and it allows users to link local events to national impacts. Users can, so when we're thinking about how we're setting up an impact or what you can do, users can scale their analysis from the local to the national using a number of different geographic building blocks, and then linking them together to better understand the spillover effects from one region to another. And there's really a lot of discretion in how you can set that up. We have data at a number of different geographies, ranging from as small as zip codes to US congressional districts, metropolitan statistical areas, US counties, and states, as well as the nation as a whole and international data as well. What's really powerful about this is that you can use these geographies to build customized regions. So if I want to look at if I want to split a state into multiple districts using counties, I can do that. So if I want to think about Texas as 8 different economic regions, I can split that region, that county up, the state up into a series of separate regions. If I want to split the country up into different economic regions, I can do that as well. So you can set those up either in terms of economic regions or territory regions for your organization, and really think about the geography and scope, not just at the pinpoint level of where the event is taking place, but how it ripples through the broader economy. And that's what IMPLAN can do, and trace those interactions and impacts between regions. And you can kind of mix and match too, right? You could think about a metropolitan area versus the rest of a state. You can think of interactions between metropolitan areas. And this gives you that full national coverage, especially for supply chain effects. As you'll see, the software is easy to use. In addition to that, all of this is packaged with excellent customer support, as well as premium support options with our team of highly experienced economists to help you guide you through the full scope of your project. I've mentioned this already, but much of the analysis that we see using IMPLAN is focused on local impacts. And to some degree, this really makes sense in that we have the most accurate and usable local economic data and models available. If you're looking at what the impact of a distribution center in a rural county in North Dakota is going to be, we have that data. We have that model. It's off the shelf. It's in the tool. And you can then link that particular model to broader regional models. So if you want to know the effects of local events, IMPLAN has that structure and model already built. But this type of analysis usually sells short the full impact of the company, industry, or the event that's taking place. So when you're in IMPLAN Cloud, the first thing you see is a map when you're setting up your regions. And when you see this, I want you to think of 2 different things. I want you to think of identify the scope of your analysis, but to do so in 2 specific ways. The first is, where does the event take place, and what's the economic region? That's the first question. Maybe that's 2 questions. But what you want to do is say, where is this event taking place? Is it a new electric car manufacturer in a particular county in Texas, in a particular MSA, a 3-county region, that's where it's happening. That's where the event is taking place. And that's where I'm interested in a particular economic impact. The second is, what is the scope of your stakeholders? Who are you conducting this economic impact analysis for? Who is your target audience? Are they restricted to that same geographic area? And they're probably not. You probably have stakeholders that have broader interests, that have diverse scope of geographic regions that don't necessarily fit directly with the economic region that the event takes place in. And so when you're thinking about setting up the model and setting up your event, you want to think about, where does the event take place in an economic sense? And where does it take place in terms of stakeholder interest? So maybe that's not just Texas. Maybe that's the southern United States. Maybe it's the full country. Maybe it's a particularly pinpointed geography. So that's that first step. The first step is to identify the scope of the analysis. And what IMPLAN is going to do when it's running the analysis, when you're using the model to set up that, to structure that economic impact, one way of thinking about it is you're measuring the total economic impact of a supply chain. And the reality is, in our economy today, most industries, most firms have national supply chains, often international supply chains. And the impact of changes to these supply chains is both broad and deep, affecting a wide variety of regions and industries. So when we're thinking about what are the impacts of a new facility or an existing facility, it's not just in the region itself, but the suppliers and the suppliers' suppliers and the suppliers' suppliers' suppliers, and all the way through that supply chain. And it's going to reach a much broader scope of industries than you'll often first imagine. And again, that local effect might be small, but lead to a broader impact in either the region or the country as a whole. And without a national analysis, you're not capturing that full impact. So the question you want to think about is, who benefits outside the region of immediate interest, and why am I not speaking to them when I do a local analysis? Why am I leaving somebody out of the scope of this analysis? Local stakeholders have an interest. So when you're thinking about this, when you're thinking about stakeholders, local stakeholders have an interest in immediate and local effects. Those regional and national stakeholders can have a broader interest in the effects of those local changes. So again, keeping in mind not just the immediate stakeholders and decision makers, but broader interest. And another reason you're going to want to think about a national analysis is salience. Certain types of analysis only make sense at a national scale. So I should go from the bottom to the top on this list. When you're looking at the impact of national policy changes, if you want to say, there's a change to some particular national policy that will have localized effects, that analysis isn't going to make sense as a series of individual local impacts. You're going to want to look at that at the national scale. If you're doing broad supply chain analysis, whether that's in terms of understanding that full supply chain, understanding supplier diversity in that supply chain, again, because supply chains are national, a local analysis is going to sell short the total impact. It's not going to capture the full extent and the full reach of what this firm or industry or event is doing. And the third piece is environmental impacts. So if you've been if you've been with IMPLAN for a long time, you may not know that we do have the capacity to do environmental impacts as well. We work with data from the EPA to measure the economic impact, not just the economic impact, but environmental impacts in terms of criteria pollutants, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, all the way through that supply chain. And again, that's where the supply chain is important, in the sense that if you're just looking at the greenhouse gas emissions for a specific region, you're not getting the full greenhouse gas emissions for what's being produced there, because everything that happens outside that region is considered a leakage, which might be fine for certain types of economic analysis. But if you're trying to understand the full environmental scope of that economic activity, you're really cutting it short, and you're really not getting to a useful set of data if you are bounding your environmental analysis by a region as small as a county, right? In other words, the scope of the stakeholders in environmental analysis are at a minimum national, if not global. And so when we're thinking about how those environmental impacts are manifest, we're going to want to think about that broader, full scope to the best of the capabilities, and that what we're looking at there is at that national level. So we're going to look at some local insights and national perspectives. What I want to do is kind of talk through a number of case studies of national IMPLAN analyses, and then do a quick walkthrough of an IMPLAN analysis at at different geographic scopes, so you can see in the software itself what those differences look like. So I want to do a quick overview of a number of different case studies. One of the great things about IMPLAN is there's no shortage of case studies. Folks have been using IMPLAN to do local and national economic analysis for decades, and there's some really interesting work out there. I just want to highlight a couple here at the high level, and then I'm going to focus on 2 additional use cases. And these are all things that you can find online as well. One is thinking about the Sanford Health in the upper Midwest. They have a number of facilities throughout North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa, and really understanding the impact of a hospital isn't just its impact, in Beltrami County in Minnesota, or in Grand Forks, North Dakota. It's the full range of those areas, and not just at the individual county level. If you're looking at what is the impact of the Sanford Hospital and Clinic in Bemidji, it's not just Beltrami County. People commute from further in, they spend their money in other locations. The supply chain for that hospital, the hospital and clinic, extends beyond county boundaries. An important thing to remember is that geographic boundaries don't always match up with political boundaries. So a county, economic activity crosses county boundaries all the time. And so you're going to want to think about it at a broader scale to capture that full impact. Another great example of this, Coca-Cola recently did a economic impact study using IMPLAN at both the local and the national level. So they looked at the impact of the full scope of their operations, from corporate to suppliers to distributors, and they have facilities all over the country. And again, using IMPLAN, they're able to delve into the impacts, not just what is the impact of Coca-Cola on the U.S. economy, but what is the impact in Georgia, Texas, Idaho, and how does that affect number of employees, goods and services provided, and overall economic activity. We've also seen an increase in the use of IMPLAN to understand the impacts of supplier diversity programs. So these supplier networks are national, and when you're looking at diverse supplier networks, and you want to measure the impact of those, such as the work of PG&E, you're going to want to look at that where those suppliers are, and those suppliers are at a broader scope. They're not just in a single location. They're through a larger region because those supply chains are national. I want to look at a couple of different policy advocacy pieces as well. So not all of the work that people do with IMPLAN is looking at the impact of a firm or industry. Some of it is used for policy advocacy. The first case is used IMPLAN in partnership with researchers at the University of Massachusetts. The Blue-Green Alliance was looking at employment impacts for advanced technology vehicles. So they were looking at federal programs to support manufacturing loans for these types of entities. And what they wanted to do was show that national impact, right? So those direct employment effects are occurring at the blue dots, right? And we see that those are concentrated essentially where you would expect kind of legacy automobile manufacturing in the United States: Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Missouri. But also we can see the component manufacturers as well, right? So when we're looking at those component manufacturers, those are scattered throughout the country. And when you're looking at that impact, the impact isn't just in those centers of direct employment. You're going to have an impact that reaches to states and counties throughout the country. And again, if you were just looking at this as a regional analysis, you're missing that full impact. You're missing the full understanding of where the jobs and economic activity are associated with these particular facilities. And in fact, there's a supplier in pretty much every state in the country. And so all of these regions are tied to facilities that may be engaging in direct employment in a limited number of locations, but the full scope of the economic impact and the full scope of that reach is much broader. Those ripple effects can be felt in a large variety of places throughout the country. Another good example of this is the work done by Americans for the Arts. If you have a chance to look at the study, it's extremely extensive. They looked at expenditure and revenue for the arts in counties all across the United States. And so the headline numbers are big, right? What are the total direct expenditures from audiences and organizations? How many jobs are being supported by them? But then they were able to break this down. So they built it up and broke it down, right? You build it up from expenditures and jobs at the local level to build that up to the overall national level of impact. And it really goes to show kind of that while there may be relatively small impacts in individual locations, when you pull this together, you're looking at 2.5 million jobs across the country. You're looking at total tax revenue of about $30 million. And so it gives you a better understanding of what does that number look like at that national level, built up from a series of very small local facilities. So again, each of these two examples kind of highlights two different ways to think about national level economic impact analysis. One is when you have a lot of facilities throughout the country and adding those together to look at the full economic impact. And the other is thinking of if you have a handful of locations, but they have a broad reach in terms of that supply chain. Also, in that case, you're going to want to look at the national impacts and the broader scope of these economic activities. So I want to jump in and show an example. So what I've set up is a fairly straightforward example. We're looking at a auto manufacturing plant in Lucas County, Ohio, and I want to show kind of where that impact, what that impact looks like locally, and how that spreads through the country as a whole. So before we even get into the economic impact piece, what I want to show is looking at Lucas County. Right? So when you're looking at analysis in IMPLAN, you don't just have access to an economic impact tool, but you have access to 2,000 counties worth of economic data, 430 congressional districts. And so what we can do is we can look at the thing I want to show is if I look at the commodity demand for a particular industry. What I want to do is look at automobile manufacturing. And what I'm looking at here is kind of to illustrate and make a point, is when we're looking at automobile manufacturing in Lucas County, Ohio, those headline numbers of what's produced in the county is very high. But what we're looking at here is essentially, the economists would call it a production function. We can think about it as an input expenditure list for that industry. And so what does the automobile manufacturing industry spend its money on as far as inputs in Lucas County? So we have those estimates here. We get this data from the BEA. And the second piece is what we call a regional purchase coefficient. And that's the percentage of the gross inputs that are purchased within Lucas County. And the important thing to see here is that these percentages are very small, which means the automobile manufacturing plant is purchasing these inputs from somewhere else. And so that means there's an impact, that impact ripples beyond Lucas County to somewhere else. It goes to where they're building that transmission and powertrain. It goes to where they're building the seating and interior trim. And so this is the first step of that supply chain. So the initial impact is in Lucas County. The second level impact is where they're making that interior trim. There's an economic impact there. That seating and trim plant has a supply chain as well. And part of that impact goes to their suppliers as well. So you start to see that this impact ripples further and further into the US economy. So it's not just one location, it's rippling more broadly through the region. What I'm doing here is showing the basics of the impact. All I'm doing is I'm looking at an industry contribution analysis in Lucas County for the automobile manufacturing facility. And then we're gonna look at these results. And I'm gonna just kind of build this up from one level to another. So what I wanna do is I wanna start in Lucas County. Like, what's the impact here? And if I had restricted my analysis to this one region, what it looks like is the economic impact is 3,700 jobs in Lucas County and about 4,800 jobs also in Lucas County, but from indirect and induced effects. So business to business expenditures drive another 2,500 jobs. Household expenditures from labor income drive another 2,300 jobs. And so those the auto manufacturing facility in total is associated supply chain and expenditure wise with about 8,500 jobs in Lucas County. And again, if I just looked at the county, that's what I'd have, 8,500 total. I'd be looking at, what are the federal tax revenue of 167 million, state tax revenue of 50 million. Well, let's expand this. So let's add the rest of Ohio. So instead of just looking at Lucas County, I'm going to look at Ohio as a whole. So a lot of folks, when they're looking at that analysis, they'll look just at the state level. And so again, same 3,700 jobs with direct effects, but then those indirect and induced effects are up, right? So we have about another 6,000 jobs in indirect and induced in the state of Ohio as a whole. So we're going from 8,500 jobs in employment effects to 14,800-ish jobs in employment effects. We're looking at almost $2 billion in value added, or GDP, and we're looking at the state level about $87 million in state tax revenue. But again, this is just a portion of the overall impact. I could say, I know that the supply chain extends into Michigan and Indiana, right? So let's just look at Michigan and Indiana. What am I leaving on the table as far as understanding of those impacts, right? So there's no direct impact in Michigan or in Michigan or Indiana. It's only in Lucas County, Ohio. So, but we're looking at another 6,400 jobs, another $800 million in GDP. We're looking at federal tax revenue of 120 million. So again, this is something I'm missing if I only look at the state in which this facility is operating. I'm not looking at the full impact. I'm missing something. And then we can look at the full scope, right? So if I want to look at what is that full scope of the economic impact, those 3,700 jobs in Lucas County, Ohio, through that supply chain, the supply chain of the manufacturing facility, we're looking at about 19,000 jobs from business to business expenditures up and down the supply, just up the supply chain. Everything that goes into manufacturing the automobile. The induced effects, we're looking at almost 1,200 jobs and about another $1.3 billion in GDP from household expenditures in those induced effects. And so what we're looking at is a difference, right? If I'm just looking at Lucas County, I'm looking at, I say the economic impact of this manufacturing facility is 8,500 jobs. But if I look at it from the full national scope, there's about 35,000 jobs that are affected and are associated with this manufacturing facility as a whole. And I'm leaving that out. From this, I can look at, I can delve into the data. That's not really the focus of this particular webinar, but I can look at, what types of jobs, what industries those jobs occur in, what occupations are we looking at, right? So if I want to know, well, that's nice, there's 35,000 jobs, what types of jobs are they? I can delve into the occupation data to better understand what types of jobs we're looking at. And again, I can use the filters in IMPLAN to really slice and dice this however I want, right? So I can look, say, we're looking at business operations specialists, we're looking at lawyers and judges, we're looking at a wide range of employment types, right? So assemblers and fabricators are primarily, so that's your basically your 3,700 jobs right there. But then all of these other job types and occupations are affected or are associated with this particular economic impact. I can also look at environmental effects. So in other words, from this particular impact, I want to know greenhouse gas emissions, right? So what this gives you, and again, this is from data from the EPA, is this is giving us, carbon dioxide emissions through the supply chain, from the oilseed farming that's affected, from the fruit and vegetable farming, and that's from household, primarily going to be from household expenditure side. So you can take this data, you can download the table, you can aggregate it however you want to query the data to better understand where those environmental impacts are coming from, all the way back up through the supply chain. So again, when we're looking at these economic impacts, if we're just looking at a particular geography, we're missing a part of that total scope. So in conclusion, I kind of want to step back to our initial 3 points that we were going to discuss. So why should you do an economic impact study? And when you do it, look at those national effects. Well, you really want to be able to tell your story. Tell the story of your event, of your industry, of your firm, and how does that particular event ripple through the economy. And those ripples don't stay local. They don't stop at the county border. They don't stop at the state border. They have a much wider range. The benefits and challenges of local and national studies, right? You need the data, the local data. You need to understand what happened in the local area, but then you can use IMPLAN to understand the broader national significance of that local activity. And then we walked through how a number of different organizations use those national economic impact studies to drive results for themselves, for their organization, and for their stakeholders. So making it understood what their broader impact is. How do they reach into the national economy in a way that may not be obvious at first blush? So I guess took most of the time. I think we have one question came in from Tim Higashi. It says, for a simplified summary, is it accurate to say that we measure national level impact by simply adjusting the regions? And that's essentially true, right? So you want to make sure you're including the full set of regions for the study, right? So the event occurs in one location. You link it to other regions of your choice using the multi-regional input-output function, or MRIO. There's a little checkbox. Go here. Right, there's a little checkbox in the upper right corner. Multi-regional input-output. What that does is that links the event that occurs in Lucas County to the other regions that I have built into my model. So yes. Did we have any other? So one other question, based on your example, Lucas County and its total impact at a national level, what sort of package should one purchase to run such analysis? You're going to need a national package to run that national level analysis, right? So if you're just interested in that local analysis and not looking at the full impact, that's a state package or a regional package. But if you really want to understand what that full impact is at that national scope, you need access to the national package of data. Any other questions, Michael? think that's it. Well, we have come up against time. Thank you for attending. Let me just go here. Feel free to contact us at sales@implan.com. We're happy to talk to you about your particular use cases and the way you can integrate IMPLAN into your analysis and intelligence systems. Again, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Have a nice rest of your day.